Okay, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for our second Good Systems postdoc presentation series this spring. It's good to see everyone here today. Of course, we had to reschedule last week's session, scheduled for the same time last Thursday, of course, due to the freezing weather. So my name is Leah Sabatini, for those of you I haven't met. I'm the program director for Good Systems. Good Systems is a research grand challenge here at UT Austin. It brings together researchers from across campus and across disciplines to investigate how we can mitigate the potential harms of AI and ensure AI technologies benefit society. One of those researchers is Dr. Tara Zimmerman, the host of this presentation series, who I'm pleased to introduce today. Tara is a Computing Institute 2020 postdoctoral researcher fellow funded through the National Science Foundation. She is working with Ken Fleischman on smart cities research within Good Systems, as well as working on projects focused on COVID-19 vaccination hesitancy, misinformation, and social media. Tara kicked us off with our first talk last month with a great presentation on vaccine hesitancy. In case you missed it, you can catch it on our events page. With that, I will turn it over to Tara, who is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Leah. We appreciate you hosting this and giving us this opportunity to share some of our work with you. Yeah, so today in the second of in our series, we're going to have Steve Slota present for us. He is a Boyve Teaching Fellow and researcher at the iSchool. Steve's research focuses on socio-technical analysis of knowledge infrastructures and the ethical development and use of technology. His current work focuses on the data and organizational dynamics of service provision for homelessness in the city of Austin. He's previously studied conceptions of the ethical, social, and policy impacts of AI among its experts and stakeholders, the infrastructural dynamics and science policy of novel data science, and the development of cyber infrastructure for the geosciences. Today, Steve will be talking to us about a brief typology of time, temporal structuring, and dissonance in service provision for people experiencing homelessness. I will help lead some Q&A at the end, so please save your questions if you have them, or if you don't want to forget them, go ahead and type them into the chat and I'll make sure that they get addressed. So thank you, and take it away, Steve.
All right, I'm gonna start sharing now. All right, hey everyone, welcome to my talk. To repeat the title, A Brief Typology of Time, Temporal Structuring and Dissonance in Service Provision for People Experiencing Homelessness. I'm really happy to be able to present this to you today. I will be presenting it again at the iConference at the end of the month of February, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts in our Q&A session after the talk. All right, so let's begin here. So as you may guess from the title, what I'm going to be talking about today is time and the impact of time and temporality on our use of data and organizational and collaborative practices. And one of the basic principles that I'm starting with is that we are already in the business of managing time, working through time, and thinking through time, even as researchers, as well as when we're working with each other or trying to negotiate our various organizations. When we formulate a problem as researchers, we're making a statement about the present interpreted through the past. And when we do our design work and actually implement our research and interventions, we're ensconcing a vision of the future that's interpolated through the problems of the present. In fact, we see our data work, our research work, and our technology design work as being a pathway from our present to a desirable future in one manner or another. But an important thing to remember here is that data is situated in time. It's a product of the time it comes from, and it impacts the future of the time when it's actually used or analyzed. And this becomes an even more significant concern when data are analyzed outside of the context of their initial creation, such as data reuse for large-scale data science or big data analytics, or in machine learning and artificial intelligence environments. And the process of recollecting and recontextualizing data, analyzing it and deploying it often does not or cannot account for the shifting circumstances of its originating environment, and raises a number of very interesting epistemological questions about what we can compare, especially when we are collecting data that seems to be similar but arises from very different circumstances. Data work is infrastructural to knowledge-informed governance, and the datafied perceptions of time often obscure the lived experience of time and have inconsistent temporal dynamics that require context and localization to be effectively understood. And in order to do this, we have to negotiate through time. As I've been saying, temporal negotiation is already fundamental to collaboration in the production of knowledge, but it's something that we often don't explore in any sort of significant detail. I would compare this, as well as this Mills reference right here, to Winner's technological somnambulism, where we essentially walk through time, we assume it, we work with it, we negotiate time, but we don't really think about its impacts, and we don't really think about we don't really consistently think about how it structures and works through our data work, our collaborative work, and our organizational work. And we do have to remember that data change over time. This image right here is a history of metadata standards for libraries. And this is a relatively long timeline, and it kind of talks about all the different ways we structure, describe, record, and curate our data in libraries. And I imagine if you look at any other field of study, you would see a similar timeline of development of metadata, of changing metadata, and of changing data coverage, scope, and description, and even format. So this is an important aspect of the data we use to consider how it works through time and how it's managed in time. And it becomes even more important when data become an infrastructure for ongoing work in governance and for managing our responses to large social problems. If we think about infrastructure, as argued by Rebus and Finholt, infrastructure development operates on what they call a long now, which is a very interesting temporal dynamic where when you're building infrastructure, you build it for the needs of the present while anticipating and attempting to accommodate the needs of the future. When we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about something that is not a static single device, not a static single building, but rather an expression of systemic homeostasis across time. You want to think about it this way: when does a highway start or stop being a highway? It's a lot like the ship of Theseus metaphor. The parts will change, the material will change, the data itself might change, but we're still talking about it as being the same infrastructure because we're maintaining that continuity and that homeostasis throughout its life cycle. And in order to think about how temporality, which in this case is not really the representation of time within data, nor accounting for time through technology, but rather a recognition of how data, its standards, formatting, utility is impacted by changing circumstances through time, I'd like to bring up some background research in the form of temporal dissonance, which is a concept proposed by Jackson et al. Back in 2012. In this theoretical work, they talked about how negotiating the various rhythms of the natural world, of human life, of organizational existence, and other work impacts our knowledge productive processes. They referred to how we distill climactic timescales to meaningful action in present timescales. They talk about how, as is in the image in this slide of the MER rover, the scientists who were working through the MER rover were actually living on Mars time, which is that 25 3/4 hour day, and managing to reorient their lives to the actual temporal rhythms of the thing that they were observing. And this is something that we do often, again, without thinking about it. We deploy observations of the past to understand the present and to conceive of the future. And as part of this work, Jackson et al. Proposed 4 different temporal registers or temporal rhythm. The phenomenal, which refers to the rhythms of the natural world and the rhythms of nature. The biographical, which refer to the rhythms and time structures of our personal lives. The infrastructural, which is that long now, that homeostatic temporality of considering how we interact with infrastructure and how we conceive of it, and the organizational, which is how things move over time and in collaborative action. And this image here, you should note, is me trying to reclaim something that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. These 4 gears on the screen, if you look at them, will not turn. Not without really significant work. And that's what one of the things that Jackson et al. Wanted to remind us of, is that negotiating these temporal registers or seeking rhythmic alignment is a part of the work we do, and it requires ongoing effort to keep the gears from jamming, as they do in this image I have right here. As they say, this makes rhythmic disjuncture or dissonance a frequent and under-examined tension within distributed scientific forms, and the complex art of rhythmic alignment a much understudied category of organizational work. And that's one of the things I sought to do in the analysis that I'm presenting today. If you want to think about it as a programmatic research question, I'm trying to submit a part of the answer to the question of how does the quality and utility of data and the knowledge produced from it evolve with changing circumstances, contexts, and environments. But in the context of this specific study, the question I'm answering is, what temporal dissonances are present in the collaborative work of the City of Austin in ending homelessness, and what does this tell us about temporality and data-oriented work supporting the social good? So most of this research took place as part of the Austin-Travis County Continuum of Care, which is called ECHO, or the Ending Community Homelessness Coalition. I know that's a pretty odd acronym to come out of those particular words, but that's what they do. Continuums of care are structures that were established in policy by the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, and they are collaborative organizations that account for all of the different service providers, government offices, and interested NGOs in a region that are helping to manage or end the problem of homelessness in that given region. To do this study, this is an initial exploratory phase of a study that we are intending to spend a significant amount of time with, where we will be working with the City of Austin and the Travis County Continuum of Care to help them use AI in their management and their mission to end homelessness in the City of Austin. What I'm reporting on here are 31 interviews of 45 to 60 minutes each, conducted with stakeholders in the City of Austin Continuum of Care, specifically among service providers in that Continuum of Care and government offices. We selected our interview participants on the recommendation of key collaborators within the City of Austin, and then built out our interview list through snowball sampling among our initial respondents. In these interviews, we sought to understand how data, knowledge, and collaboration directed and structured service provision. We deployed critical incident technique, asking each interview participant about a recent project that was still in process, a recent project that resolved in a particularly interesting or satisfying way, and a recent project that was not quite as satisfying or not quite as successful. And for each of those projects, we asked them about their data practices, their collaborative practices, the on-the-ground work that they were doing, and any of the outcome measures and metrics that they were deploying. We use thematic analysis for its ability to accommodate both inductive and deductive analysis, both of which were deployed in this particular study to help us understand the findings that I'll be talking about shortly. During our inductive open coding phase, time and temporality emerged as really significant themes when we were thinking about the work that the city was doing and how they worked with each other. We then drew upon the theoretical framework of Jackson et al. To help us characterize and understand these dynamics and tensions that arose out of time. And across this, we found 4 really significant tensions. The top 2, the tension of documenting with acting and the tension of planning with acting, we perceived as being along that infrastructural register. And then we also saw tensions along the biographical and organizational registers and the phenomenal and organizational registers. And I'm going to go into that in more detail right now. So along this infrastructural register, We noted that time itself is a resource and a limited one, and that bureaucratic requirements to document, collect, and organize data were in tension with actually providing the services that needed to be provided. In that case, most often it was the data quality that suffered. As in this quote here, it goes back to we're asking the service providers to self-report the data when they're out in the field and to tell us where they're going. And so there's some challenges in that we want to honor our service providers and desire to protect the people that they're caring for. So the challenge is, how do we encourage staff to give us all the data that we need, but also to walk that line? And this really captures that infrastructural register tension between desiring to document and reason about their activities and actually undertaking those activities. In similar fashion, they found that the data standards themselves introduced a significant tension in this desire to document and this desire to collect data and establish an infrastructure for future analysis. I think it's good that in a community we have this snapshot in time, and this quote refers to the point in time count that they do on a yearly basis to assess the state, location, and quantity of people experiencing homelessness within the region. But the data is fuzzy. At best, it's imperfect. It depends on the weather. It depends on the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, that's the national organization, definitions that year. So they actually ran into challenges with the changing definitions of homelessness, the changing distinctions in how data are collected, and the changing descriptions of the data itself. In similar fashion, data could be used to predict and understand trends, but only when it was relatively recent. Data management required sustained work over time and collaboratively in order to keep the data accurate, useful, and effective in actually guiding planning activities. Well, yeah, and that we couldn't determine how to make it sustainable. So that kind of makes it, we just weren't able to identify a way to do that at a large scale and on an ongoing basis. And I left a little bit of the language of this interview participant in here to show how frustrating and tense trying to talk about this was for many of our respondents. But what we see here is a tension between being able to act and being able to provide the services they wanted to, and being able to plan for the future. And a lot of that tension was expressed in the inability to keep data up to date, keep especially collaborative data collected in other places, well coordinated at a large scale and on an ongoing basis. And this was something that was relatively challenging because present needs and future goals were often in tension. Data begins here to play a much more visible role in resolving tensions between present work and future directions, and time remains a key access for understanding and structuring work. It's an important thing for funders and the public to understand that when you subject a young child to homelessness, both the transience of what's happening to that child, it's baked in. And it also normalizes that sort of life, and it doesn't give them some of the opportunities you hope would happen for children. So I think that if you look at the earliest stages of prevention, you want to make sure that any child's time being homelessness is extraordinarily brief and best prevented on the front end. So the harms of homelessness are experienced in both the short and the long term. Ameliorating these harms required ongoing effort, knowledge infrastructures to support that work, and more specifically, responsive knowledge infrastructures that allowed them to act in the immediate present to limit that very short-term harm while still being able to plan for the future and mitigate harm that might happen down the line. You might hear something that's a bit redolent of the long now of infrastructure development, and that is a parallel that we've noticed as well. On the biographical and organizational register, short-term constraints of organizational engagement required some steps to happen before others. They required a certain rhythm, such as the need for having legal identification prior to applying for housing. The ID issue is kind of time sensitive in the next 30 to 60 days, but really it's not even developed into anything as of yet, but that is going to be a time sensitive thing. A lot of these people don't have IDs currently. And that's one of the requirements, that you have to have an ID in order to move into a lot of these housing opportunities. In similar fashion, even the natural flow of life and exploration was in tension with efficiency and standard practice. This quote talks about providing housing for people who have aged out of the foster system and have not had the sort of familial and community support that is usually expected of our young people. There's a very high rate of rehousing for youth. I think it's currently about 32% of youth are not successful in their first apartment and need another or need to be rehoused. You might experience that as this huge failure of the organization not to anticipate needs, but as we've collected data and let it play out, it's actually looking more like this is actually a part of the developmental journey. Seeing them make that first stumble is a learning opportunity that almost seems to be necessary for some of them to learn to be successful in their next placement. And so while most people, when they were young, they did this kind of experimenting with the safety net of their parents, of their community, of their relatives. This is a safety net that does not exist. And so there's a significant tension between the biographical rhythm of learning, exploring, of making mistakes, and the necessary organizational rhythms of trying to resolve cases in an efficient manner and reduce the overall load on the system. Due to the nature of the community of people experiencing homelessness and the shifting landscape of regulation, funding, and long-term priorities, data itself even became less useful as the time they accounted for became more distant. They did significant work in fairly consistently and over time to keep their data up to date, but always felt that they were falling a little bit behind. As stated by this participant, I've been able to access the system data and do a couple of rounds of what we call targeted assertive outreach, where we contact everybody in the system to engage, to clean up the data, to discharge youth who no longer need services, and to update and in some cases reassess youth whose circumstances have changed. And this is that tension between the phenomenal and the organizational registers. Along that line, it was complex in the amount of data that had to be shared in the entities that we needed to share. So lots of fully HIPAA compliant organizations and also trying to gather data from our criminal justice system, which is incredibly hard to do, ironically, harder than our healthcare system. I still don't understand that. This was slow, data intensive work requiring significant cooperation in the face of numerous barriers. The ability to be responsive was in tension with the slower pace of large-scale data analysis, both internally as organizational outcome measures and externally according to the requirements of funding. And so in this, we developed the Jackson et al. Framework to kind of demonstrate the tensions that we saw in providing services to people experiencing homelessness. We found under the concept of temporal dissonance, two clusters of tensions and register along these registers, one that was largely interpersonal and one that was largely infrastructural. On the infrastructural register, documentation, creation of data was in tension with the ability to act and provide services, as well as actually analyzing that data was also in tension with the ability to act. And in the interpersonal, the biographical, the rhythms of someone's life, the rhythms of growth, exploration, and the needs of an individual experiencing homelessness were in tension with organizational goals to provide services in an efficient manner and consistently across time. And in the same way along that phenomenal register, actually observing the world was similarly, sorry, there's background noise here, was similarly in tension with the organizational rhythms of work. And so throughout these interviews and in our understanding of the activities of the continuum of care, time was both a limited resource and a constraint on infrastructural activity. Knowledge work supporting the continuum of care's efforts was substantially oriented towards resolving these temporal dissonances, keeping data up to date, maintaining sustainable collaborations and data sharing agreements, maintaining consistent accuracy of data collection and high quality data collection practices. What we especially found interesting related to the Jackson et al. Theory that we were working from was that the infrastructural register was not a single set of dynamics, as was implied in that paper, but rather we discovered several distinct rhythms endogenous to that infrastructural work, many of which were often in tension with each other. A very key point is that data rose and fell in utility and viability as its rhythm moved into and out of alignment with the other rhythms that we were observing. And this confirms a theoretical proposition of Olmsted in 2021, talking about biodegradable data in smart cities, the notion that data is not consistently useful over time, and especially as policy environments and urban circumstances change, that for the smart city, data that they collect often biodegrades or becomes less useful. And we found that happening here as well. And so we want to argue that there's a need to resolve these temporal rhythms with the scope and coverage of the data and local organizational context. And moving to the conclusion, and I apologize for running a bit longer than planned today, but we'd like to conclude that knowledge itself is temporally situated, and practices around knowledge are embedded in an understanding of time born of normative expectations or external rhythms. That negotiating these temporal scales then becomes a fundamental factor in knowledge work and something that requires an understanding of the temporal registers of that work. There's a need to not only identify areas of temporal dissonance, but also to seek out and identify areas of temporal coordination where the rhythms of work productively align. In doing so, moments of time where significant change and particularly effective use of data might be more effectively identified. Thank you, everyone. I also want to thank the collaborators from our team, Min Kyung Lee, Isha Nigam, Michelle Circa, Kiana Evans, Tara Zimmerman, Destiny Moreno, David Cruz, James Snow, Sarah Rodriguez, Khalil Balat, Divya Rathanlal, Jonathan Tomko for their organizational, methodological, and conceptual contributions to this project. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have at this time.
Great job, Steve. Great job. I can help to kind of organize our chat, or we're a fairly small group. If you want to just unmute your mic and ask your question, that'd be great. If you feel more comfortable typing in the chat, I can read that out for you. So let's just jump in. Does anybody have any questions? I'll go ahead and start with mine because this is something that I have worked with you a little bit on this project, as you mentioned, Steve, but not at this level. So the temporality of the infrastructure and the data, when you discuss it, it's a fairly academic, esoteric almost topic. How do you translate that into your work with these city officials and with these people who do very different type of work that's not kind of academic in nature? They're saying, how does this affect me?
So the first part is to remind them that this is work that they're already in the business of doing. Part of what I'm doing in this talk and in this paper is applying theoretical language to work that is already being done and is actually a fundamental part of how you maintain. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Sorry about that. How you maintain your data, how you work with funders, and how you organize and collaborate with other people. And to talk about their benefit, just calling attention to it can help to identify times where they know that the work is going to be more frequent, more dense, more difficult, even when they can't really adequately or effectively predict, as given the responsive nature of their ongoing work. Knowing that there is some mechanism of rhythmic alignment, or just being attentive to how temporality changes their ability to work and their ability to respond, is useful to have in mind. So I guess I'd say it's of benefit to the actual people we're talking to here as a sensitizing device, or as something to help them be a little bit, to fall back on winter again, a little bit less somnambulist, a little bit less sleepwalking through their negotiation of these rhythms, and to be more intentional about managing the distinctions between organizational, phenomenal, biographical, and infrastructural time.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. Somebody else want to jump in with a question?
This was indeed an esoteric topic. I probably should have shared the paper first.
Wow, that's great. You did a good job explaining it.
I have a question, but it's lunchtime, so
Yeah.
just I'm kind of going back and forth between grabbing some lunch, and so my Zoom keeps going off. So I couldn't jump in before because my mouth was full. But I wanted to ask you. You may have done this in the talk and I missed it. But I wanted to ask you about infrastructure and how you're thinking about infrastructure in relation to how you think about just the semantics of the term for a project like yours, particularly since this concept that we've already homed in on of the biodegradability of data in smart cities work is it's such a clearly such an interesting concept, but then it for me it calls into question what we're even thinking of as infrastructure, right? So yeah, just I could go on about it, but I'd like to hear you talk about how you use the word and how you think we might use the word.
I was actually hoping for a question like this because I cut a longer discussion of infrastructure theory out of an earlier draft of this talk.
Cool.
So I'm glad for the opportunity to talk about this a little bit.
Great.
The conception,
in that case, I may follow up too.
Yes. So the conception of infrastructure that I'm using here is the one that was originally developed by Starr and Roulater in their study of the worm community system. In that, they posit that infrastructure is not a thing stable through time and not necessarily a physical artifact, but rather a relationship between an activity and the systems, people, policies, and organizations that support and enable that activity. So when I talk about infrastructure or call something infrastructure, I'm actually presupposing a relationship between desired outcomes and the existing resources that can help support those outcomes. And that means that depending on where you're standing, pretty much anything can at any time be infrastructure to something else, but it doesn't mean that everything is infrastructure all the time, if that makes sense. That in a given environment, you have and can observe and reason about infrastructural relationships. And that's where infrastructure becomes a powerful tool for research, because those relationships can help you identify dependencies, moments of tension, places where you can design for the future in a way that thinking of infrastructure as a stable system do not. And that's why concepts of homeostasis and the long now become important, is because you need to build infrastructure that can maintain this relationship between desired outcomes and resources, even as the situations and the desired outcomes themselves change. And I lost you for a little bit there, Sam. I hope that was the part you heard was a good enough answer.
It was great. I was just demonstrating, the problems with our contemporary infrastructure. Imagine if we were in person and someone just disappeared for a minute and then reappeared. That would be very odd. Sorry about that, but no, that's great. And then, I doubt that you talked about this in the minute that I was there, but I'm really taken right now with the doubling of critical infrastructure in the engineering world, right, which means essential infrastructure, and critical infrastructure in the humanities world, which means infrastructure that we critique, right? And so do you think about like a sense of like layers or priorities of different kinds of infrastructure when you think about it in this relational way, following from Starr?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that later infrastructure studies, Anand and others later on have talked about in detail is that infrastructure is a messy accretion of different systems. And that kind of accreting towards a homeostasis of consistent use is something that does respond well to a lot of critique, especially when we, as we do today, organize our built spaces around semi-permanent infrastructure that may or may not continue to function as infrastructure through the future. We're building a lot of liminal spaces and a lot of excluded spaces just in the physical environment through infrastructure. So there's a lot of leverage for that sort of talking about infrastructure as being both critical in terms of roads, process of the economy, national safety, availability of electricity and water, and infrastructure is critical in how those very same things create spaces of exclusion and marginalization, even as they're kind of supporting their work. If you want an example, even from this site, many of the camps we see and observe are related to availability of infrastructure, having access to water, access to potential resources and showers, and often are physically located in those marginal spaces of our built infrastructure, underneath overpasses, near bridges, along those kind of marginal spaces. And so it's a very interesting set of dynamics. So we have a question in the chat, I think, from Jared. Question about entrainment. Was it that stakeholders were entrained to different rhythms than infrastructure, or were the rhythms unidentifiable or chaotic? I would say that that was a little bit of both. One of the kind of fundamental theoretical principles that comes from the Jackson piece that we use to inform our analysis of this site is that biographical rhythms, which like the rhythms of daily life, the rhythms of daily work, you're waking up, you're falling asleep, you're interacting with people, are already something that you're negotiating against organizational rhythms. If you want to think about it in terms of sociomaterial practice, Orlikowski talks a lot about how human practice and organization around technology and collaboration defines the concept of time. Your biographical rhythm is something that you conform to the rhythms of your organization. And similarly, effective work in both of those spaces involves conforming your rhythms or trying to find places where the rhythms align between organizational work, between biographical rhythms, and between the rhythms of infrastructure, which, as we found here, were much more complex and numerous than we had originally expected. And there's reason to believe that the other rhythms are similarly complex, and we might find that level of complexity if we dug deeper into them. But it's less that they're unidentifiable and chaotic, and more that there are many, many places for rhythmic disjunction, rhythmic tension, and rhythmic dissonance. Anyone who has been at work when they've had a call from a school about their children can see how organizational rhythms are in tension with each other and with the biographical rhythms of their own lives and their child's lives. It's something that requires a lot of work to make happen. And then we have a question from Donna. As a follow-up to Jared's question, how exactly did you identify and trace these rhythms at a very specific level and in a specific way? What was the method exactly? That is a very good question. And a lot of what we were doing wasn't trying to quantify and account for the rhythm specifically. What we were doing in our analysis was, in the open coding, I identified a lot of tensions that had to do with time and had to do with temporality. And so in the recoding, in the deductive coding, used the theory proposed by Jackson et al., what we were looking for were moments of temporal dissonance. So while we can't really have this holistic account of all the different rhythms, the places where their intention was a very key indicator for us as to these are moments of rhythmic disjuncture, and these are moments where different rhythms ought to be considered or are in one way or another relevant to the collaborative or the data work that's going on.
Well, okay, can I have a follow-up?
Yes.
How did you, so I get the tension part, so there's a tension around time, but how did you recognize that it was a rhythm? Because a rhythm is a very specific temporal construct. It's repeated, right? There's to Jared's point about entrainment, there's a pacer that's driving this rhythm, as opposed to there's a tension and it's time-based, which isn't the same thing as rhythmic.
Right. So our definition of rhythms came from the Jackson et al. Piece. And when we identified those tensions, we also looked for rhythms that fit within their definitions of those rhythms, which is some level of repeatability, some level of predictability over time, with the possible exception of phenomenal rhythms, which is a bit more, even in that piece, is a bit more of a wide category. Because it refers to rhythms of the natural world or rhythms of whatever you're observing when you're conducting science. And so a temporal rhythm of, say, the temporal rhythms of a tornado chaser, for example, trying to do research on what happens in tornadoes is going to be very different because it's not predictable. It doesn't follow the usual patterns of predictability and happening in a consistent fashion, but it is something where you need to adjust your own rhythms of work to the rapid and unpredictable timescale of what's happening in the world.
Yeah, rhythms, can definitely be irregular. There's still such a thing, right? A heartbeat can have an irregular rhythm. I just, you answered my question. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an excellent question. Something I struggled with too was the appropriateness of using the term rhythm to describe those really irregular and unpredictable things.
Yeah. And well, can I ask, what does rhythm buy you outside of just temporality then? Does that make sense? So I know that was Jackson's framework, but without being able to identify very clearly, this is the wavelength of that rhythm, this is a pattern. What do we get from understanding that it's rhythmic versus just temporal?
So I'm going to wander around before coming to an answer to that question a little bit. But in that paper, they also use the term register, which in this conversation might have been a better term to use. And they used it essentially as a synonym, but it's what rhythm offers us, or what temporal registers offer us, is the notion that there are different paces and frequencies of occurrence that need to be accommodated when we're doing knowledge work, especially accommodated epistemologically, not just organizationally. So what it really buys is that recognition that knowledge work is in some way operating on either compressing time, expanding time, or cutting through time in order to reason about things that have happened in the past, are continuing to happen in a way that makes sense to us in the present and enables us to kind of guide work. Yeah, and a lot of musical metaphors. I actually had to restrain myself from not including too many musical scores as images in the slides.
I loved it. I actually loved it. I think Barber uses register, if I'm correct, in his collective communication design. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Oh, okay. Well, he's here, so I thought about that.
Sorry.
I love the idea of, sorry, I wasn't quizzing you. I was quizzing him. I really enjoyed the idea of register. That's a very great metaphor. So thank you so much for your talk. It was fantastic, really excited. And I look forward to the paper. You mentioned, will it be shared later? You mentioned at the beginning.
It will be shared later once it's actually published following the conference.
Okay. Well, I look forward to checking it out. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're just about out of time. I just want to thank everybody again for being here, and thank Steve for his great presentation and sharing his work with us. And to remind you that we'll be meeting again soon to hear from Kathy Hill about her work. So please join us, be watching for that, and sign up with our program, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.